So welcome to this philosophy class. Great to see you all. I'm Father Tim or Tim, whatever you're more comfortable calling me. And it's great to see you all here. So I'm going to basically start by just reading through this long description. And I know this is looks like a big, thick packet of paper. And just know that there are many options for how you choose to engage with this little experiment. And this is a kind of experiment, like any teaching and learning is experimental. So we're playing around here with what's it like to learn after church? How's our attention span? Are we tired and want to go home or meet another time? But all of these things can be worked out all in good time. Rosie, thank you so much. Does anybody not have one of the handouts? Charlie and Susie over here. Thank you, Rosie. Excellent, excellent. Good, good. So there are also some extra flyers if you want to take one to whatever to share it with other people or just to remember that you came or whatever. But we'll read through this. So this is philosophy class with Father Tim, a class at All Souls. Today is Sunday, October 26th, 1224. We're starting a little bit later, but that's okay. And I'm planning to go for about an hour. But we'll try to keep it timely and finish on time. And the location is here in the parish hall, Taylor Hall. Welcome to our Sunday philosophy class. This 1 hour class will be a weekly class occurring every or most Sundays at All Souls after the coffee hour or the lunch hour in the parish hall. There will be some Sundays when we will not meet because of other parish meetings, events, or commitments, such as vestry meetings, the parish foundation meetings, or others, perhaps speakers, etc. But we will try to meet most Sundays, and I'll provide you all with advance notice when we will not be meeting. The goal of this class is to learn, explore, and pursue wisdom, which is the true meaning of the word philosophy. In Greek, philosophy, we'll get into this, means love of wisdom. We will explore a great variety of ideas, practices, texts, and themes, but they'll all be grounded in this overarching idea of wisdom, which is described many places in the Bible, but one place is the biblical book of Proverbs that depicts wisdom as a very powerful and guiding force in our lives. This class is also a subset of a larger project which was started recently by my friend and colleague and teacher. I'll talk a little bit about him, Dr. Samuel Longcar. And that project is called the Plato Parsha Project. So I'll explain what Parsha means a little bit here. But we are officially, if you go to the Plato Parsha Project website, listed as a local chapter. I think it just says my name, so it doesn't say All Souls. But we are a kind of chapter of this broader project, a global and broader movement studying the texts of Plato over the course of the next year. And maybe we'll do some other things too, but that's our foundation. The word Parsha comes from the beautiful Jewish practice of reading a parsha or portion of the Torah. The Torah is the teaching or the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible or Old Testament. Sometimes it's called the teaching of Moses. Sometimes it's called the Pentateuch. Lots of names for that, but it is the foundation of the Bible. And the Parsha is read each Shabbat, that is each Saturday, by Jews everywhere around the world. Yesterday's Parsha was the story of Noah and the flood. So it just started. The new cycle of reading the Parsha just began with Genesis 1. And so we're acknowledging this practice in engaging with philosophical texts each week. We will therefore be following this very, as Father Harvey already noticed, at the end of your packet is a very heavy and intense curriculum or reading schedule. Don't be intimidated by it yet, but I'll talk a bit about this. Um, that's also online. And basically, we are engaging with Plato, who some of you may have heard of. This in many ways, kind of the founding figure of philosophy. And we'll be exploring Plato's texts and how they relate to religion, to the Bible, to scripture, etc. So this reading schedule that you have in the packet, it technically starts on October 1st. Don't worry about that. We're going to read it at our own leisure. It's kind of just a guide for us. Come on in, Julian. Come on in, you guys. Yeah, take one of these. And each week being part of this bigger project, the Plato Parsha project, gives us extra resources. Each week, my friend Samuel, Dr. Longcar, will upload a video on his YouTube channel. The videos are about 20 to 30 minutes, and it's a short lecture on the weekly text from this curriculum. I think there are two videos up there so far. So there's a video on the first Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro, and the Apology, which is some of you may have heard of, a very famous dialogue in which Socrates defends himself and his way of life in front of the Athenian court and assembly. So we will get to that. But these are wonderful videos that are additional resources if you want to learn. And you can also follow along the Plato Parsha project on Substack. If anybody here uses Substack, I'm trying to curb my addiction to Substack. What did you say, Linda? Rosie. Oh, Rosie say okay. Well, you are, yeah. It's addicting. It is like all social media. It's kind of addicting, but it is a great resource. Yeah. Um. So, the reading schedule is attached. Now, there are at least 3 ways that you can participate in this group that we're beginning. And those vary in terms of time and commitment. The first, very simple, is you can just show up here for our hour-long meeting on Sundays. And you can do that in person. You can do it on Zoom, or you can watch the recording after anytime. So that's like an hour of total time to commit to. Sometimes it's helpful, I find, to have, if people think in terms of time, like how many hours am I committing to this every week? That's like an hour or more. The second, if you want to go a little bit deeper, is to come to the class and then listen to some of Dr. Samuel Longcar's YouTube lectures, or some of the writing that he's posting on Substack, and that would be a little bit more. Now, if you want to go really deep and do the full 52 weeks of Plato, then you can. Now, to do that, I'm calling that the deep dive. This is my Plato book. This is the full body of texts written by Plato. Now, there's something extraordinary about this, which I'll say. We have in existence, extant, meaning manuscripts, editions of every text that Plato wrote that we know of. In other words, these texts have been incredibly well preserved since Plato lived 2,500 years ago. That's interesting. That's not the case for the Bible. There are lots of texts that are made reference to in biblical texts and other texts that we have lost. But all of Plato's texts that he wrote that we know of from other sources have been preserved. And so if you want to invest in a library of philosophy, this is the best place to start. This is it. I think the Plato Complete Works, it's edited by John M. Cooper. I think it's around $60 on Amazon. So that is, pricey. However, if you really want to buy this and the financial cost is challenging, let me know. Please let me know, and we can figure something out. There's another sort of shorter, the first 5 dialogues in here, a shorter version that I list on here as well. That's $12 on Amazon. We're going to be starting with those dialogues anyway. So if you want to just, invest $12 rather than the 65 or, whatever, that's great. But again, if you need assistance with these, let me know, and I'm sure we can take a look at the adult formation budget in the church, and we'll figure something out. So the last page is just the Zoom link again for the weekly meeting. I don't see anyone else on here, but it's good that we're recording. So that is the syllabus or the info packet. Let's pause now if folks have questions just on the practical aspects of this. Any questions?
How are we going to know if there's not a class?
Rosie asked, how will we know if there's not a class? Good question, Rosie. I will send out, or we will from the office send out a constant contact email. It's the same source that the announcement came out for this Sunday's class with the Zoom link. So we'll try to send that out, sometime early in the week. And Rosie and I will work on that. And so you will know. So anybody who's not, if you're not currently signed up for our weekly newsletter, please do so, because that's how we reach folks, through constant contact. So do sign up. What's the easiest way for people to sign up for the weekly newsletter? Is there a form online, or just email the office?
The church office at allsoulsmb.org. I feel like a lot of people over here have the email for the church office. You can also call me and we can set up something. If you have me on constant contact, you can also forward over emails and then they get, replied over to me. So
Great.
any way you can, any way you want to, you can write it down, put it in front of the office too. I'm flexible.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosie. Great. So do sign up for the weekly newsletter. That will be how we communicate about the class. Any other questions? Julian, any questions from you? Okay. Wonderful. So this is our first lesson, meeting session, or shiur. That's in Judaism. Sometimes the word shiur is a little lesson or a reflection on the Torah, on the teaching of Moses, on the Bible, on scripture. And we're going to explore all of these things together through the lens of philosophy. And so I'll just start by giving you all a bit of a personal story about how I first came into contact with philosophy. So I'll give that story. Now, also, I'm going to talk for a little bit, 12:35. I'll see, maybe, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, I'll talk, and then we'll have questions. But if you have a burning question while I'm talking, feel free to raise your hand and just ask the question. I'm fine with that. I don't mind interruptions. If you don't want to be recorded, then, maybe we can turn the recording off when we have question and answer. But I think if anyone's uncomfortable with that, just say so, and it's fine. So I'll start with my experience with this term philosophy. I think I first encountered philosophy maybe in high school. I had a wonderful teacher, a Latin teacher, who was a priest. He was a Catholic priest, but he had been an Episcopal priest before he became a Catholic priest. And he was a fascinating and wonderful and inspiring teacher. And our Latin group went to Rome, Italy with him our senior year, and he really introduced me to the classics and also to Christianity in many ways. And he was very inspiring. And I think I must have encountered the term philosophy and the figure of Plato at some point in high school. Maybe I read the Symposium, which is another very famous text of a party. It's basically a drinking party where Socrates and a bunch of folks are friends are gathered together. They're drinking wine. They're celebrating a friend who recently wrote a very successful play that was performed in Athens. And so it's a party. I think I read that text at some point, but I don't really remember when. My first real encounter with sort of the difficulty of philosophy was in college. So probably my junior year, I was required to take a course on epistemology. That's a very fancy, philosophical word that just means exploring how it is that human beings have knowledge, what they can know, how they come to know it, and how they share and develop that knowledge. But that class of philosophy started with figures that were from the 17th century, so like 1700s. So in my mind, I thought philosophy started in the 1700s. I thought it was like a very new phenomenon, a new thing that goes back to like 1700s. Doesn't go back before that. But if it does, it was, and some of you may be familiar with this narrative of philosophy, that philosophy was opposed to religion. Philosophy was opposed to religion, and that Socrates was a great founding figure of atheism, that is, not believing in God. This is a narrative. It is not true, of course, as we will see and we will explore. Socrates was charged by the court of Athens with atheism, of not believing in the gods of Athens, but it's much more complex than that, and we will see. In other words, I thought of philosophy as being opposed to religion. That may sound somewhat familiar to some of you, maybe not. But that is a very popular story of philosophy, that it began when the Enlightenment happened in that period of the 1600s, when human beings started to actually become smart, less superstitious. They started to abandon religion and religious belief. They realized that religion was simply a cause of conflict and war and violence. And so what do we need? Reason. We need reason. The birth of science happens, the birth of the scientific method, the birth of modernity as we know it happening in the Enlightenment. And philosophy is this great harbinger, the one who brings enlightenment to human beings and frees us from the shackles of superstitious religious beliefs. That is a story. I think it was the story that I received in my own education. That story was challenged for me at seminary when I started to learn about philosophy and about how philosophy was actually much older than the 1700s. It went way, way back, and that there were many very important religious thinkers and figures who were deeply philosophical. You might think of Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval Catholic theologian who studied the texts of Aristotle. Aristotle, one of Plato's students. Plato, one of Socrates' students. So there's a chain here. And Aristotle was studied by Aquinas and by many other important medieval figures. And there was a great sort of revival of philosophy under Aquinas and the Dominicans, if you're familiar with that Catholic order, etc. But my encounter with philosophy was really through a person. And this is very important for philosophy. I'm going to emphasize that it's about people, and it's about encountering a person who is inspiring to you, who may challenge your views, your beliefs, but it is not so much about a set of beliefs or doctrine or dogma or, intellectual life. That's all good stuff. I'm not saying that's bad. but it's primarily about a person and people. So Samuel Lonkar, who I've mentioned, he was one of my teachers at seminary, and he taught the medieval theology class. And I'll never forget being confused, really confused. And if anybody here is feeling confused right now, or not sure, that's a good sign. That's a good sign. So the first point I want to make about philosophy is get in touch with your confusion. If you're confused about something, what I'm saying, what I'm teaching, thanks be to God, because you've already begun the philosophical journey. And we'll see how that works with Socrates. We'll see how that plays out. But I had this teacher, Samuel, and he was trying to explain to our medieval theology class Saint Anselm of Canterbury and his argument for the existence of God. If anybody is familiar with this, it's very challenging. I don't think I could even explain it now. But it's basically an argument for God's existence that Anselm, who lived in the 1100s or 1200s, he developed this argument to try to prove to people that God exists. And he gave this as a kind of meditation, a kind of tool that if you walk through this process, it will be obvious to you. You'll prove through your reason that God has to exist logically. God has to exist. So Samuel was trying to explain this argument, and I had no idea what he was talking about. No clue. I couldn't get it. It was like, sometimes when there's like a puzzle, right? Like a logical puzzle, you're trying to wrap your brain around it. And the more you think about it, the more confused you get and the more lost you feel. And there's a moment where you're like, oh, I think I understand. No, I don't get it. Right? It fades from you. It's amazing how the human brain works in this way, that it's like waves, right? We think we understand something, and then when we try to articulate it, even through speech, we realize we don't actually know what to say. We can't articulate it. We kind of freeze up, right? So I was introduced to this teacher. He became my good friend. He still is my dear friend and teacher, Samuel, and who's leading this bigger project. And I was attracted to his teaching precisely because I did not understand it. There was something about what he taught that made me want to learn more. Maybe it was because I didn't understand it. I had this desire to understand, right? When we don't understand something, we might have a desire to understand. We can also have the experience where we don't understand something and it just feels frustrating, confusing. We feel overwhelmed. We feel, what's the word I'm looking for? Disempowered or discouraged, right? Oh, I don't understand this. I don't understand what this person is saying, this teacher is saying. I feel discouraged. I'll never understand this. It's too hard for me, right? That we can have that experience. But we also can cultivate a kind of patience and even learn how to be comfortable with not understanding things. So philosophy is a kind of learning this practice of learning to be comfortable with not understanding things. And even learning, actually, more than that, to enjoy and derive pleasure from not understanding things. We'll see more about that. Okay. So that's a little bit of my story. Now, I started studying Plato and learning Plato with Samuel. This was after seminary when COVID started, because I really was overwhelmed by COVID. And some of you may have had this experience as well. COVID was very scary. It was very anxiety inducing. It brought about so much uncertainty in our lives. And I think we're still healing from that in many ways. But I needed something to ground myself. I needed something spiritual. And so I started just reading through these texts with my friend and teacher, Samuel. And I started to learn his own story with Plato and with philosophy. And this is all on his YouTube channel. And he started to describe it as a process and experience of healing. Healing. That is, the more he read and studied Plato, the more he found healing in his life, healing of body, of soul, spirit, of mind. And what we'll see about Socrates and Plato is that they are, in some ways, early versions of psychotherapists. They actually, that word therapy comes from the Greek word therapeia, which simply means care. Care. So a psychotherapist, a psyche, the Greek word psyche, therapeia, is someone who cares for souls, other people's souls, but first and foremost, as Socrates teaches, their own. So in some way, we can all be psychotherapists. I'm saying this with great, I know I'm being recorded. We're not all licensed psychotherapists, although some in this room maybe are. I'm not saying we should all go out and, practice psychotherapy, but we, in this basic way, we are all responsible for caring for our own souls. And the more we learn to care for our own souls, as folks in this room, clergy and other caring professions will know and recognize as familiar, the more we learn to care for our own souls, the better we get at caring for other people's souls, right? And I, as a priest, of course, am responsible in some ways for people's souls, right? So I'm kind of a philosopher, a psychotherapist. What is a priest? I'm still figuring it out and learning. I don't know, but I'm learning what a priest is, and there are many interesting aspects to that. But it's all comes back to this idea of care. And so these early philosophers, Plato, Socrates, will see that they really cared about other people and about their souls. And that stemmed from them learning to care for their own souls. Okay. And Rosie, thank you. It is a nice coincidence that I am the new rector of All Souls, right? So there are many souls, and there are many souls in the world. Um, So that's a little bit about how I came into, to discover Plato and these texts. And I will say also, I found them healing in my life. So that was a big change for me from learning about philosophy as this very elite, academic, intellectual exercise in a university with these famous professors, or whatever image you have of philosophy, of people striding around the halls in suits and bow ties, and I'm a philosophy professor. Sure, that's great, but philosophy started in the ancient world as something very different, and it was much more similar to religion, to what we think of as religion and religious movements. And so I'm going to introduce philosophy as some kind of combination of the disciplines or the fields that we think of today as religion and psychotherapy and science and mathematics, very important to Socrates and to Plato. All these things existed kind of together in the ancient world. It's only more recently that we've divided things up into a lot of different disciplines: religion, science, philosophy, psychology, math, physics, astrophysics, nuclear physics, whatever, all these divisions. But it's all really just knowledge, and it's all really just wisdom, right? So, philosophy, that word, it's a combination of the word philo, which means love in Greek, and sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy is, quite simply, a love of wisdom. That means that it relates to our desire and our passion. I use the word desire here in a very broad sense. The Greek word is eros, where we get our word erotic, but that is, in the ancient sense, it's much broader than just what we think of as erotic. It includes that, absolutely, but it's much bigger. It has to do with our desires for everything, for food, for intimacy, for spirituality, for a connection with God, for knowledge, for wisdom, for scientific understanding. It's all of our desires, right? Eros is just much bigger, and desire is much bigger. We also today have tended to confine that to one specific area of our life, right? Desire, as in, sexual desire, and it's just related to that. But that's really unfortunate because desire is the foundation of the philosophical life. And we see that in the word itself. We have to cultivate this sense of desire, of eros, for wisdom. So that's the meaning of philosophy. So I'm going to give a little bit of historical context just to ground us, because there's a lot of abstract ideas and theories, and I want to ground us in the history here. So philosophy, this word itself, we don't see it emerge until probably the Greek historian Herodotus. Some of you may be familiar with Herodotus, who's kind of thought of as the first historian in Western European, Western history. And Herodotus describes something about the great king of Athens named Solon, and how he went traveling around to different nations and cities in pursuit of knowledge or wisdom. And so when he would encounter other kings, they would say, "Oh, Solon, you are very wise because you go around and you seek learning things. You try to learn new customs, new practices, new cultures, new beliefs from all these different cities around the Greek Mediterranean world. And so you're very wise." So we see that kind of definition emerging. But it's not till a little later that we really see the word fleshed out in its full meaning. And it's really Plato who fully defines and embodies what it means to practice philosophy. And philosophy is a practice. So there are two important points I want to make here about philosophy. First of all, and I'm using this wonderful book here, which is it's called "What is Ancient Philosophy" by a French scholar and philosopher of the 20th century named Pierre Hadot, Hadot. It's a great book. It's a little academic at times, I find, but also really incredible erudite text from a great expert who's no longer alive, but in the 20th century of philosophy. And he makes two important points about philosophy. First of all, it emerges as a way of life, a way of life. So it doesn't emerge initially as a way even of thinking, or as a set of ideas, or as some kind of set of texts that are about very abstract things like life and death and God and goodness and beauty and justice, etc. It emerges primarily as a way of living, a way. Interesting that in the book of Acts, we see that the first term, the earliest term that was used to describe Christianity was the way, with a capital W. It may also remind you of something that Jesus says: "I am the way, the truth, and the life," right? So Christianity, there's little hints here that Christianity in its origins was seen as a kind of philosophical movement or a way of life. What does a way of life mean? What does that mean? It means it embodies a set of practices, right? Practices and customs, not just ways of thinking, but doing things. Prayer, practices that revolve around eating food, practices that revolve around drinking, around ethics, right? How we conduct ourselves in relationships, everything that you could think of as a way of life. Now, what's interesting about a way of life is that we don't come into the world with the consciousness of having to choose what way of life we follow. And maybe I think probably most of you here have thought about your way of life before, right? Because Christianity is a kind of way of life. It involves practices, it involves community, it involves ethics and customs, etc. But what's interesting about a way of life is you have to make some decision at some point in time, right? Like maybe it happens, I don't know, when we're a teenager, or maybe in our 20s or in our 30s, or whenever it happens, or maybe later, right? That we're like, oh, I could live a good life, or I could live a bad life, right? I'm not saying that as it's not any kind of judgment. It's just, isn't it possible? You can think about this question. Is it possible to live a better or worse life? Now, that is something that only each of us can decide individually, of course, right? There's no judgment. No one can tell us you're living a bad way of life. It's something we come to realize ourselves, and it may not even be that harsh, right? Oh, I'm living a bad way of life. I want to change my life. I want to live a good life that brings me happiness, joy, pleasure. But there's this experience, which is sometimes referred to as conversion, a conversion experience. One of the great scholars of this is a scholar named A.D. Nock, N-O-C-K, like knock on the door, but without a K. And he studied ancient conversion. And the idea of conversion, that is having a moment where you realize that you want to make a radical change in your way of life, that originates in philosophy and in the philosophical schools, okay? Second important point is that this philosophy was all done within a community. It is not an individual enterprise. In fact, the dialogues of Plato are all conversations between two or more people. This is not one individual alone in their room writing down what they individually think, saying, I am a philosopher and I'm really smart, and I think that God is like this and beauty. No, this is very different. Philosophy is always done in community and in what were called schools. That is where we actually get our word school. It initially means something like a community of leisure. Schola in Greek actually means leisure. I don't know how leisurely school was for you all or how leisurely it was for me, but that is the original meaning of school is leisure. Philosophy also begins in talking, like I'm doing now. In Greek, the word for talk is logos. That's where we get our word logic, right? Logical. But the original meaning of logos just means talking. It's very simple. It's just what I'm doing with you all now, what we're doing together. And Socrates believes, we'll see, that you can only discover the truth through talking, not thinking, right? Because thinking is different than talking. I could sit here, you all are sitting very silently and respectfully, and you may be thinking, and you are thinking, you're thinking in listening to me and following along to someone who's talking, but I'm talking that's different than thinking. I don't know how much thinking I'm doing. I'm doing a lot of talking, but it's hard to talk and think at the same time, isn't it? Right? You this may maybe but you understand what I'm saying, right? Like I'm talking, but the thinking sometimes comes after the talking. Sometimes we say something and then we say, ooh, I should have thought a little bit more about what I wanted to say to that person, and I regret I didn't think about it because I hurt them with my words. I wasn't thinking. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that. I wasn't thinking, I was angry. I'm sorry, right? We know that experience. So philosophy is about talking and learning to talk and enjoying talking. Philosophy also, in its origins, included a lot of interesting practices or spiritual exercises. We'll see that one of Socrates' famous practices was he would stand motionless in some place. Just he would just stand, he was standing, but he was not moving, and he was just staring off in the distance. And he would do this for long stretches of time, which is odd, isn't it? I mean, if I did that, in the middle of a service, well, that would be a problem because then the liturgy wouldn't continue. But if I just stood out on the street, doing that,
We call 911.
maybe you would call someone, Susie, but you probably wouldn't think, oh, Father Tim is emulating Socrates by standing. But Socrates was often late. He was late for the dinner party of the symposium because he's standing out on the neighbor's porch, just standing there for hours, not moving. What was he doing? We'll see. We'll see. We'll explore. But he had interesting practices like this. Socrates was also famous for being capable of drinking copious amounts of alcohol and not being affected by it. This is very interesting. There are other figures in other religious traditions who this is attested to. Socrates was also apparently able to withstand extremely cold temperatures. We hear that when he was a soldier and fought in these important wars that Athens fought, like the Peloponnesian Wars, he was able to walk around in the snow barefoot with little clothing on. Which is so he did strange things with his body, and he was capable of strange feats with his body. Okay, this is interesting. Anyway, we'll get to that. There's a little bit more history, but I want to stop to leave some time for questions. I know we started a little late, so if folks need to leave at 1:15, you can leave. We'll try to end early. It's 1:04 now, but I do want to leave time for you all to ask questions. I'll just say a few more things about the kind of historical context that we're going to encounter for Socrates and Plato. This is the 5th century in Athens, a very important time in Athenian history. And Socrates is a figure that emerges. There are other philosophers before Socrates, and there's a group called the Sophists, which maybe you've heard that as a derogatory term for someone. Oh, a sophist is someone who is teaching just in order to get paid, just for money, right? All they care about it is this is kind of what Socrates says. The reason he says he does not accept money from people for his teaching is because he's distinguishing himself from a group of teachers called the Sophists, who were basically like private tutors to Athenian young men. Young Athenian men, what did they need? They needed to be trained in one particular art, the art of rhetoric. Rhetoric is how you speak. Why did they need that? Because in order to succeed in political life, and all aristocratic Athenian young men were being trained to become politicians because it was a democracy, right? So all Athenian young men need to learn how to speak persuasively with and entertain people, right? Be a good politician. You got to be a good speaker, right? You got to inspire folks. So the Sophists say they emerge as this is kind of the origins actually of education, of the idea of modern education. Before the Sophists, education was not a specialized discipline. It was just adults, young people spending time with adults, just interacting with adults. They would learn how to become adults and be good citizens. There was no specialized job or school or calling of education, but before that, really, it was just sort of informal contact that young people would have with adults. But the Sophists emerge as private tutors who can teach young Athenian men how to be persuasive politicians, right? This is part of the context of Socrates and how he will distinguish himself from the Sophists and say, I'm not like them. The context of Homer and Hesiod, who are the great poets of Greek mythology. Homer, of course, who writes the Odyssey and the Iliad. There is something about philosophy or Sophia in these texts. It mostly has to do with like practical skill. So in the Odyssey and the Iliad, this term Sophia, wisdom, it really means like practical know-how, like being good at something, a craft, like making a chair, making a boat. It's skill. That's what wisdom is in this earlier historical context. But we also see it in the context of poetry. So great poets like Homer and Hesiod were inspired by the muses, who were divine figures, the gods. They were inspired to write beautiful poetry. And poetry and wisdom, the wisdom inherent in poetry, was something that humans could also learn to heal, to use to heal. And so reading the Odyssey or the Iliad was seen, in this line of thought as a kind of practice also of healing. So we see already some of the undercurrents of what philosophy is, right? Um, so finally, we get to this figure of Socrates, and I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna ask for questions.